This keyboard is interesting. Some might even say weird. Some of it's good, interesting, some of it maybe not so good. The Skyloong GK104 Pro takes a modular approach for some unique customization options, including the option to swap a row of keys for knobs and up to 2 LCD screens. There's also a super helpful function that I wish more keyboards had. Let's take a closer look at the GK104 Pro and see if it's worth the somewhat confusing price tag. Before we dive in, I want to mention that EpoMaker sent me the GK104 Pro for the purpose of reviewing it. I was not paid to make this video, and EpoMaker has no input on my review. I do have an affiliate link for you in the description if you're interested in picking up the GK104 Pro and you'd like to support this channel. There will be links to wherever I can find this, EpoMaker, Amazon, check the description. All right, now there are a few confusing things about this keyboard. First of all, there are multiple versions that you can get. Some of them are available on Amazon, some on EpoMaker's site, some directly on Skyloong's site. I hope I'm saying that right. There are some inconsistencies though with the names and the models and the options, which makes it a little hard to know exactly what you're getting in some cases. There's a version that includes 2 LCD screens, which definitely has a slightly higher price. Then there's this version, which just has the 1 LCD screen, but not the knobs already included, which I believe is $119.99. Then on Skyloong's site, there's the Office version, which kind of looks like this version, and that one I haven't seen anywhere else. So it's a little bit confusing. And on EpoMaker's site, there's an option that says it's a wired-only version with 1 screen, but the images don't load when you select that option, at least not when I tried. So I'm a little confused. Now there is a knob kit that you can get separately to swap out 3 keys here and replace them with knobs, which is pretty cool, but that wasn't included in what EpoMaker sent me. All right, so before I give away any more feelings here about the GK104 Pro, let's do our usual review of features and specs, a sound test, then we'll get into the pros and cons.
The Skyloong GK104 Pro is a 100% keyboard with 102 keys or 96 keys and a color LCD screen, and the option to add a row of encoder knobs and an ANSI layout. You can get the GK104 Pro without the color LCD, and it still has a screen in the top right corner with a calculator function you can enable with a switch on the right side of the keyboard. The construction is ABS plastic, and there is only 1 color option shown on EpoMaker's site, but multiple color options shown on Skyloong's site. The dimensions are 452 by 146 millimeters with a front height of 25 millimeters and a rear height of 36 millimeters without the keycaps. The weight is 1,295 grams or 2.85 pounds. There are fold-out feet in a total of 3 typing angles. Connectivity includes Bluetooth for 2 devices with 125 Hz polling, 2.4 GHz with 1000 Hz polling, and USB-C wired with maybe 8000 Hz polling. More on that later. Internals include a hot swappable PCB compatible with 3 and 5 pin switches, a top mount structure, and polycarbonate plate. There is foam between the PCB and plate, pour-on foam stuck to the bottom of the PCB, and thicker foam in the case bottom. The stabilizers are plate-mounted and pre-lubricated. The PCB does not have support for PCB-mounted stabilizers. Switch options depend on where you purchase the GK104 Pro. On EpoMaker's site, the only option is currently the KTT Rose Pink linear switch, but on Skyloong's site, there are also options for KTT Rose Silver and Rose Sea Blue. It's even more confusing on Amazon. The keycaps for the black and gray color option are Side Legend Shine Through PBT in an OEM profile, but the keycaps vary on the other color options. Backlighting is full south-facing RGB, and the modes can be controlled with key commands and in the software. They're pre-programmed Mac and Windows modes controlled with key commands. Customization is done with the GK6 Plus app, which is available for Windows and Mac OS. Customization includes remapping on the Windows, Mac, and a 3rd layer, creating macros, and controlling the backlighting. The GK104 Pro is available from EpoMaker, Skyloong, and on Amazon for a variety of prices, but the model I'm reviewing appears to be $119.99 US, while the model with the extra color LCD screen is $139.99 US.
All right, now let's start talking pros and cons about the GK104 Pro. First up, let's talk about a very useful feature, the calculator. The GK104 Pro takes advantage of the LCD screen over here by adding a little switch on the right-hand side of the keyboard that will change your number pad to a calculator when you flip that switch to the on position. Now, the numlock key will serve as a clear all, and then every other key kind of functions the way that you would expect it to. So you can simply do some quick addition, subtraction, multiplication. It works pretty much the way you would expect a basic calculator. And then you simply flip the switch back to the other position and it goes back to its normal operation of showing you, by default anyway, it shows you the battery percentage, the connection type, the mode, Windows or Mac, and then the date. This feature didn't feel like a gimmick at all to me, and I honestly did use it several times while testing it. I actually wish more keyboards had this feature if they had an LCD screen, because I actually found it very useful and it worked as expected with no issues. All right, the next pro is the wireless. Both the Bluetooth and the 2.4 gigahertz worked well for me during my testing. The polling rate is 1000 hertz for the 2.4 gigahertz connection and 125 hertz for Bluetooth. I didn't have any bugs or issues with either connection while testing it, so the stable wireless for me was a pro. Now, while we're talking about polling rates, let's also talk about the wired polling rate here. Both EpoMaker and Skyloong's site, they mention an 8K or 8000 hertz polling rate over the wired connection. However, on Skyloong's site, they have an optical model with 8K in the name of the model. So that makes me wonder if the higher polling rate is specific to the optical model, or if all of the models really do have 8K wired polling. Now, if it does, the actual performance in terms of latency will depend on the MCU and whether that bottlenecks the report rate to the computer at all, because not all MCUs can actually process or handle polling rates that high. But either way, the polling rate should be plenty high enough for gaming use over both wired and 2.4 gigahertz connections, because even if it's not 8000 hertz, I wouldn't expect it to be lower than 1000 hertz considering you have 1000 hertz over the 2.4 gigahertz connection. All right, another pro here is that you have the ability to add a second battery cell in this particular model, at least the one I'm reviewing here. The Pro model with two LCD screens actually comes with two 4000 milliamp hour batteries for a total of 8000 milliamp hour, but this one that comes with just one screen still has two power connectors on the PCB, and there's a space in the battery compartment for a second one. So if you can find the same 4000 milliamp hour battery cell online, you can have yourself a double capacity, and without having to power that second screen, that should mean pretty nice battery life. Speaking of battery life, they don't give an estimated use time in the spec, so I'm not sure what they expect it to be if you do use the screen full time and the backlighting full time. However, because this isn't a full color LCD, it should be a little less power hungry than the model that has two screens, because the second one's a little bigger and it's a full color LCD. Another thing I'm counting as a pro here is the split spacebar. Now, I could count this in the neutral section because some people may not prefer to have a split spacebar, but I'm counting it as a pro because in the box they include a one-piece spacebar and a one-piece stabilizer set. So you can change it out if you don't like having a split spacebar. You don't have to buy anything extra. It's just in the box. You can convert it if you want to. The reason I like having the split spacebar is it gives you some additional opportunities here. Whichever side you tend to use less for your actual space, whichever thumb you use less to hit the spacebar normally, you can map the other side to do something else. For example, I tend to hit the shift key with my right thumb all the time, so I can map the left side of here to be a left shift key, and that way I don't have to move my little finger as much to hit the left shift. I can just use my left thumb. Of course, there are all kinds of options that you have, but that's just why I like having it. Another pro is that you have the ability to swap your print, scroll, and pause keys up here for a set of 3 encoder knobs. They're not included with the keyboard, but you can buy them separately, and there's no difficult modification necessary because the switch modules are hot swappable just like switches. You can even swap the nav key cluster for the second screen if you want to. Now, while neither of these is totally necessary for a lot of people, it's cool to offer that type of modular customization that doesn't require a lot of DIY work. All right, now let's talk about the sound a little bit. For a keyboard in this price range that's all plastic, it's not bad. I'm counting it as a pro that there aren't any bad resonances or rattles. The stabilizers don't have any, bad rattly sounds out of the box. There's nothing that I feel like is contributing to the sound in a negative way. And I count that as a pro, especially with an all plastic board. Sometimes they can sound hollow. And stabilizers, certainly, you can get rattly sounds that require tuning, but there's none of that here really. So I'm counting the sound as a pro, but whether you like the actual sort of pitch of the sound, that's very subjective, so that would be more in the neutral category. Now there is one thing about this sound that we'll talk about in the neutral section, so let's move on and start talking about those neutral items. Now in this category I talk about things that are either very subjective or maybe they're kind of pro and con together, wrapping up the conversation on sound. The neutral thing I have to say is not about the mechanical sounds, but of the electronic sounds. This keyboard actually can make sounds when you type or use the number pad. And it did when I first connected it. It was rather surprising, and the sounds are not really what I want to hear while typing, so thankfully you can turn them off. Basically, this just feels like a gimmick to me. No offense if you find a use for the sounds, but I just don't think it's a necessary feature. But I'm not counting it as a con because you can turn it off. All right, now let's talk about something we usually talk about in the neutral category, and that is design. Design is almost entirely always subjective unless there's something obviously great or obviously terrible, and in this case, it comes down to personal taste. It's a pretty straightforward design here, except for the screens, of course. It's a pretty inoffensive design, in my opinion, in terms of the visual appearance. But we will talk about the keycaps later. All right, next I'll mention the layout. It is a full-size layout, so it's going to take up quite a bit of desk space. I actually had to switch to a wider lens for my overhead camera because it is a larger keyboard than a lot of the ones I've recently been reviewing. Now, that does mean you get a nice, comfortable amount of space between your key areas, the alpha keys, your nav keys, and your number pad, and you've got room for the screen above that number pad as well. But some people may prefer their number pad keyboard to be the more condensed 1800 layout or 96% layout, so it doesn't take up quite as much of your desk space. That's all down to your personal preferences though, so it stays here in the neutral section. Now let's talk about the typing feel. I don't have a strong pro or con about it, so to me this is all down to taste. It's a relatively firm feel, but there is a small amount of what I would call localized flex because we have a polycarbonate plate here. So when you combine polycarbonate plate with the top mount, you have a little bit of flexibility because the plate is not super stiff, but you don't have up and down movement across the board here, pun intended, because it is literally attached to the top of the case. It definitely doesn't feel soft, but it's also not quite as rigid as other top-mount keyboards that have a harder plate material. All right, next up, let's talk about these switches. My unit was sent with KTT rose pink linear switches, which are 38 gram. They feel a little lightweight for me, my personal taste, and they also feel a little bit scratchy to me. They're honestly just not my favorite. That is very subjective though, so other than them feeling a little bit scratchy, if you like lighter weight linears, they might be okay for you. If you don't like lighter weight switches, then maybe the rose silver switches, which are 45 gram, would be a better option. Now on Skyloong's site, there are a few more switch options than what I saw on EpoMaker's site, so you might want to compare if you're shopping for this particular keyboard. Now the last thing in the neutral category is the build quality. This one is not in this category because it's subjective, but because it's not really a pro or a con. The quality of the case here is like a half step below some other keyboards I've reviewed this year, like the EpoMaker TH80 Pro V2. It's not poor quality. I wouldn't say it's bad quality or anything like that. It's just worth noting that it's definitely not above average build quality for this price point of about $120. All right, now let's talk about some cons for the GK104 Pro. The biggest con here, in my opinion, is the customization app. It's probably the worst one that I've used, at least in the last year. Normally, I count it as a pro just to have the ability to do some customization, but in this case, it's confusing to use, very not intuitive, and recording macros honestly just doesn't work the way it should, and in fact, it didn't work at all for me. I was able to map some keys and key combinations after taking several minutes to figure out how to use that key combination feature, and then you have to click on save, and then you have to click on apply, and it downloads your settings to the keyboard. Now it did work for me after unplugging the keyboard and connecting it to a different device, so you can get most of the features to work. It's just not simple to use, and like I said, I couldn't get macros to work at all. The app also seemed to continue running even after I used the quit command on my Mac, so I had to force quit it every time. Oh, and one more thing, while it's nice to have a Mac version, my MacBook was convinced that this was malware. It did not want to run this program. I had to give permissions several times and manually override things saying it wasn't going to run because it couldn't identify where it was from and it might be malware. So, you know, that's always fun to see. All right, now another con that I think does apply to more people, and it is about the keycaps. In terms of side legend shine-through keycaps that I've tested, these are on the low end of the ranking. The legends are not crisp at all. They're quite fuzzy on several of them, and on the inside, there are these lines in the material that vary from one cap to the next, so the amount of shine-through on each one isn't consistent. The top of the keycaps doesn't feel terrible. There's a little bit of PBT texture, But overall, the quality, my opinion, just not great. One other small con here is that I don't know how much you can trust the battery level gauge that is on the screen. It increases at a seemingly normal rate when you have the USB cable connected to charge it, but the second you disconnect it, the battery level drops by quite a bit. I'm not sure what that's about, but it means that I wouldn't trust it beyond just kind of a ballpark of the battery level. And lastly, the final con I want to mention is just about the confusion on the different models and options that I mentioned earlier. I just don't understand why there can't be a fixed set of models and consistent names for them across any site that sells them. All right, so let's consider this model, which from what I can tell is $119.99 in the US, and the features you get compared to a full-sized competitor with similar build quality, and that would be the Keychron V6 Max, which is priced at $99. With the GK104 here, you get the LCD screen with the actually useful calculator feature, and on the V6 Max, you don't get that feature. You also get the ability to add a second battery cell and double the capacity for a longer use time between charges, which the V6 Max is not designed for. However, the V6 Max does offer 1000 Hz polling over wired and 2.4 GHz connections. It does have QMK firmware, with VIA for remapping and adding macros, which is light years better than the software for the GK104 Pro. It also has an encoder knob included, and the build quality, I would say, it's still all plastic, but it's a little bit better overall. So if the customization of the key maps, layers, and especially creating macros is important to you, but the screen is not as important, the V6 Max would be an easy recommendation. But if you don't do any type of remapping or macro use, and you would use the built-in calculator all the time, then maybe the GK104 Pro is actually worth it. Now, I can't comment on the model that has both screens because I don't have the screen to swap in here or the model that comes with the screen, so whether that feature is useful, I can't really say. So that'll do it for this video. Let me know what you think of the GK104 Pro. Let me know what you think if you picked one up for yourself, and if you got one with the encoder knobs or the second screen, let me know about how useful those features are. Don't forget to subscribe to the Semi-Pro Tech+Gear channel, and while you're here, why don't you check out one of these videos? I know you'll enjoy it. Thanks everybody. See you next time.